let me introduce you briefly to Jan Eliasberg, who's the author of Hannah's War. Hannah's War, published in March of this year, is Ms. Eliasberg's first novel, but she's well known as a screenwriter and director for film and television. Her writing for the screen has included the shows Salem, Fearless, and Spirit of St. Louis, and a forthcoming major studio movie about the women air service pilots in World War II. I'm looking forward to that one. She's directed hundreds of hours of award-winning television, including the classic Miami Vice, Netflix's 13 Reasons Why, The Magicians, Nashville, Supernatural, and countless others. An MFA graduate from the Yale School of Drama in Directing and the MFA program for writers at Warren Wilson in Fiction. She also has a long-standing connection to the library, I was pleased to hear. So we'll welcome Jan Eliasberg with Hannah's War. We're also delighted to have with us Ellen Feldman, who is a 2009 Guggenheim Fellow and the author of, among other books, Terrible Virtue, The Unwitting, Next to Love, Scottsboro, which was shortlisted for the Orange Prize, The Boy Who Loved Anne Frank, translated into 9 languages, and Lucy. Her last novel, Terrible Virtue, was optioned by Black Bicycle for a feature film. Paris Never Leaves You is her newest book and was published last month. Ellen is a longtime library member, and we've been very pleased to have her at our lectern on several of her previous books. So we welcome her to the stage as well to introduce us to Paris Never Leaves You.
Hi, I am Jan Eliasberg, and thank you for that beautiful introduction. Because it was mentioned, I will tell you my connection to the library. I went to Brearley when I was growing up in New York, and of course the Brearley girls used the Society Library for research of all kinds, but most importantly, my mother counted the New York Society Library as really her favorite thing in New York. That was her favorite thing to do, was to walk up to the library, stay the day, and check out some books. So I'm very, very happy to be here. I'm going to read the first chapter from Hannah's War, and then I'll just put it into a little bit more context for you. They come for me at dawn, as I knew they would. I've slept in my clothes, and I ask if I may step into my shoes. They allow that, but nothing else. They tell me to go outside, and I do. Parked on the dirt road between my barracks and the laboratory is a vehicle the Americans quaintly call a paddy wagon, an absurdly chipper term for the dank iron trolley that will transport me from Los Alamos to the prison at Fort Leavenworth, where I will wait again, not for long, I fear, for my perfunctory trial and inevitable execution. The chain reaction leading to my death has been accelerated by my own divided heart. I see that now in a way I never could when all was theory. White chalk on blackboard, equations like pale bones scattered across scorched earth. The man I shouldn't have trusted latches the manacle around my wrist and affixes it to a hasp welded hard to the bench. I'll protect you, he says, with such earnestness it makes me smile. You're lying again. He glances over his shoulder, sufficiently assured that no one can see me. He takes his face between my hands. I will protect you, Hannah, if I can. I think he might kiss me, but that would be a danger to both of us. He is a meticulous and cautious man by nature. Most lovers are, skilled at the art of keeping secrets. I have limited empirical evidence to support this hypothesis, having loved only 2 men, but both of them held the truth at a safe distance. Safe for them, not for me. His promise of protection, however well-intended, does not comfort me, so I comfort myself with equations. The distance from the laboratories in Los Alamos, New Mexico to the prison compound in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas is 874 miles. We left in the dark of night and are traveling, I estimate, at an average speed of 42 miles per hour, allowing for stops. Oh God, will they stop? Will they allow me that simple comfort? No, I won't think about that. The equations, stay with them. I drum the fingers of my free hand, playing an invisible keyboard on the metal beside my legs. This is my habit when I run numbers. This habit of drumming my fingers on hard surfaces, desks and tables. A distance of 874 miles at an average speed of 42 miles per hour creates a probability of 20.8095 hours of actual travel time, plus the approximately 27 minutes it would take for the MPs to force the paddy wagon to the side of the road, slide a bag over my head, and stay with the equations. I will protect you, Hannah, he said, if I can. A distance of 874 miles, leaving in the dark, allowing for the variable, if I can. So that is the opening chapter to Hannah's War. It is from the perspective of Hannah, who is the lead. She is an Austrian Jewish scientist who's been working at Los Alamos in the inner circle with Oppenheimer on the critical assemblies team. And she is suspected of being a spy. And the interrogator who comes to find the spy is a man named Jack Delaney. He has been questioning her. And in the process, there's been a game of cat and mouse between them because Hannah's a very, very smart woman and she's not going to be questioned without figuring out some questions of her own. She notices that Jack is keeping secrets just as she is. And so there's a kind of checkmate between the two of them. Jack has fallen for her, not in a physical way, but he has fallen for her intelligence and her sensitivity. And essentially against his own desires, he has now had to put her in the paddy wagon to Fort Leavenworth, where as a spy, she will be tried in a sham trial, because that's what was done at that time. If you were suspected of being a traitor, basically you got there and a couple of days later you were executed in front of the other prisoners. And that's where she is at the beginning. And then we go back and find out how she got there. And by the end of the book, we pick up and see how everything spins out from there, and what those secrets are that she was keeping and why she was keeping them. And you'll have to read the book to find out.
Okay, well, that's pretty chilling, Jan. I'm Ellen Feldman, and it's nice to be with so many members again, even if I can't see you. I'm imagining I'm in the members room with all of you. And I want to thank you, Sarah, for that wonderful introduction. Also, I want to say to members who know Sarah only in her capacity in the library, she's the perfect moderator for this because she wrote a delightful book that touches on World War II, 1,000 Dances. So she's just great to be here too. I'd like to read part of the prologue of Paris Never Leaves You. It takes place shortly after the liberation of Paris. Now, we've all seen, or most of us certainly have seen, old newsreels and still clips of the liberation of Paris, August 25th, 1944. And cheering crowds, champagne corks popping, young women and older women throwing their arms around the arriving soldiers, GIs looking sheepish and delighted. And everybody was very happy. Of course, it was the end of 4 years of horror and misery under the Nazi occupation. The scene I'm going to read takes place a few weeks later, probably. It could have been a few days, or probably a few weeks, when revenge sets in. This is the dark underbelly of victory. France had been defeated very, very quickly. There was almost no war in France. The army collapsed immediately. Not to say there wasn't suffering, but there was no war. And the French felt humiliated. So Frenchmen decide, how do they get back their pride? They take it out on French women. It's very peculiar because at least as many French men as French women collaborated. The Vichy government, the collaborative Vichy government was all men. Women didn't even get the vote in France until after the war. But this is the way the revenge after France, after the liberation worked out. I will say that once de Gaulle took over, he put an end to this. He said, we're all Frenchmen, we all suffer together. But until that time, it was very, very dicey. It was women who were shamed, who had their heads shaved, which I will read that scene, and in some cases were murdered. That was rare, but it did happen. Okay. The name of the protagonist is Charlotte. Charlotte did not want to watch, but neither could she tear herself away. She stood riveted to the spot, mesmerized by the hatred, immobilized by the fear. They had stripped the woman down to her brassiere and underpants, threadbare graying straps of dignity or modesty or some barely remembered decency from better times. The brassiere was torn at the nipple, whether from current violence or past passion was impossible to tell. An old man with a tobacco-stained beard reached out a filthy hand and pinched the pink flesh. The crowd roared its delight. A young man brandishing a rifle used it to prod the woman first one way, then the other, until she was stumbling on the high heels she was still wearing. The shoes made her nakedness more obscene. As she lurched, the crowd caught sight of a brown stain on the seat of her torn underpants. Again, it was impossible to tell whether it was the sign of current terror or past slovenliness, but the jeering grew louder. It drowned out the sound of the church bell that had begun to toll and continued after the bell went silent. It was only 2 o'clock. Collabo, a woman in the crowd howled. Collabo horizontal, another screamed, and the women in the mob took up the cries and passed them around as they would under other circumstances have handed a baby from one to the other. Both instincts were primitive and protective, though in this case of self, only the hardest or most forgetful among them, those who had never given a civil nod to a billeted soldier or uttered a merci for a door held, could fail to see themselves in the place of that woman, huddled in shame as her hair fell to the ground in greasy clumps. Her days of black market meat and eggs and shampoo were long gone. The women in the pack howled their rage, but the men, especially the silent men, were more dangerous, and not only because they brandished the rifles and wielded the shears and razors. The men reeked of sexual malice. Some of them clutched their crotches as they heckled and punched and kicked the women. Others sweated and smirked and wiped the spittle from their mouths with the back of their hands, then ran their tongues over over their lips as if they could taste the thrill. Their country had been defeated. They had been humiliated. But this wreaking of vengeance, this rendering of justice, this half-naked woman stained with blood and tears and feces made them men again. Holding Vivi, that's Charlotte's infant daughter, Charlotte began pushing her way through the mob. Drunk now on justice and the wine an enterprising woman had begun selling, but not yet satiated, the crowd pushed back against her, urging her to stay, sneering at her for her tenderheartedness, taunting her for her lack of patriotism. She put her hand on the back of Vivi's head to shield her and kept going. At the edge of the crowd, a woman from the camp stopped her. "You can't leave," she said, and pointed to a group of women and one man in a corner of the square, waiting for their turn with the tondeur. "It's not over." Charlotte shook her head. "As long as this goes on, it never will be," she said, and kept going. The woman stood looking after her. "Holier than thou, that one," she observed to no one in particular. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do we have an echo from one of your computers, possibly? Maybe that fixed it. So thank you so much. Those are both really stunning passages and very gripping right at the beginning of each book. I thank you for the shout out to my little effort at historical fiction. Ellen, I do want to just add that whether because of that or not, I really enjoyed and appreciated reading both of your books. And yes, I did a certain amount of research related to World War II, although a very different part of it. That's part of it being a world war. It happened all over the place. But it really did return me to some of the terrible but fascinating aspects of that period. So I have a few questions that I hope will lead us into some conversation. And my first one is for Jan. So Hannah's War includes some actual historical figures, such as Wild Bill Donovan and J. Robert Oppenheimer. But two of the three main characters, I believe, are fictional characters who were inspired by real people. Do you want to talk a little about Dr. Lisa Meitner, the inspiration for Hannah, and the point at which her real life story turned into Hannah's fictional one?
Absolutely. So it was actually in a library that the inspiration for the book came to me, not the Society Library, but the 42nd Street Public Library in the microfiche room. I was doing research for the film project you mentioned about the women air service pilots, and I just wanted to see the New York Times headline on the day that we bombed Hiroshima, given that that was the end of the war. And I was reading, because of course, once the huge banner headline, was sort of arresting, but then there were all of these articles, including one that explained to the entire world what this secret Manhattan Project was, because it had all happened without any knowledge from the wider world. It was even scientists at Los Alamos, many of them did not know what they were working on. That's how secret it was. And I got to about the 6th or the 7th paragraph, and it said the key component that allowed the Allies to develop the bomb was brought to the Allies by a female non-Aryan physicist. No name. And I thought, how is it possible I don't know who this woman is and have never heard of her before? This was arguably the most important discovery of the 20th century. And I became possessed to find out who she was, why her name wasn't on every science textbook in the world. And once I did start researching, it was fairly easy to find her. Why she remained such a secret is a much longer story. But she was an extraordinary woman named Dr. Lisa Meitner. And she, in fact, had been working at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin all during the 30s. She was the only woman who was allowed to work there. And she had really attained quite a prominent position, although she was treated terribly. I mean, she was literally given a lab in the basement, in the closet where the janitors kept their cleaning supplies and mops. But she was so brilliant that she had allied herself, or perhaps he had allied with her, knowing that he needed her brilliance, with Otto Hahn. And together they collaborated for about 20 years. And in the process of that collaboration, she recognized that they had done an experiment that split the atom. And she identified it, she wrote about it, the paper was published, she called it nuclear fission, which was really the process of breaking the nucleus in two and releasing this extraordinary amount of energy that then allowed for the bomb, but also for many good things as well. And I read her story, and there were so many captivating things about it. Among which was the fact that right as they were coming to the heart of this discovery, she had been told, being Jewish and being Austrian, she had been assured by all of her colleagues that nothing would happen to her, that the Nazis wouldn't touch her because she was so important, and she was working at this extraordinary research institute. It was the most important in the world, and they wouldn't let anyone lay a finger on her. Well, Austria was annexed, and the next day, one of her colleagues, unbeknownst to her, actually told the Gestapo where she was, and she had 6 hours to leave the country. Nobody raised a finger to help her, and she fled to Sweden. And in fact, it was when she was in Sweden and her partner was still in Germany that she discovered the splitting of the atom. So the confluence of those things was so extraordinary that even that, really put me in a very sort of, I knew there was that story to tell. But in my research, which was extensive because I really started to research the history and the science, of course, of developing the atom, I became fascinated by what happened at Los Alamos and realized that that is also a story that really hadn't been explored in fiction. There was a TV show, but it didn't last very long, that was set in Los Alamos. And I realized as an American that I wanted not just to explore the German part of the story and her experience, but I also wanted to look from the perspective of somebody who had literally seen what happens to pure science when the military marches in and says, this is no longer an institute of science, this is now a military installation, and you are not working on anything except weapons. To take the perspective of that woman and to put her in Los Alamos, where there was an extremely, it wasn't even a truce because the military was there in this uneasy balance with the scientists, and the scientists were there to do what they thought of as pure scientists, and the military was there to make sure that what they were doing led to what the military wanted, which was the bomb, and in a certain period of time. And I thought, if I can put this woman there, I can show certain things about the morality of science, about what happens when scientists falls into the hands of the military, the hands of the politicians, how it gets taken away from scientists and it goes, it's the Pandora's box story. You've suddenly let it out without really quite knowing what's going to happen, and you can't put it back in the bottle. And so I came up with this spy element to the story, and originally that was kind of a frame for telling the German story, which was hewed much closer to the actual Lisa Meitner story. But as I spent time working on the outline and researching, I began to feel like the Los Alamos story really had as much weight, or maybe even more. And then I started developing other characters, Oppenheimer being one of them, but also fictional characters like Jack Delaney, who is the military investigator who comes to catch that spy. And it really had to do with what I wanted to explore, that I was not writing a biography of this woman. There is a very good biography of her, but I was inspired by the situation she was in to investigate a much larger questions and a larger scope.
And it works very well. Thank you. So parallel question for Ellen then. So with regard to fiction about real historical figures, Paris Never Leaves You is actually a little bit of a departure for you. You've written several prior books focused on actual historical figures such as Margaret Sanger. So were there specific real life inspirations for some of your Paris Never Leaves You characters? Or is it really the situation and the ethical questions raised by the period that brought them to life? I also note that I know that some of the material in the 1950s scenes in the New York publishing world is actually based on your experiences. So you are the real life character a little bit, I think, for some of that, or feel free to contradict me.
No, you're absolutely right. I wrote about Eleanor Roosevelt, Margaret Sanger, where was there to go? But what really, the inspiration for Charlotte was the women who were the exact antithesis of Charlotte. I read a lot, both for research and pleasure, about World War II. And the memoirs, the biographies, the histories are full of women who fought for who spied for the Allies, who fought in the resistance, women correspondents who risked their lives to cover the war. And I'm always fascinated by those women, who of us isn't? But I kept thinking, what about women who were not blessed or cursed with their courage? What about an ordinary woman like me? And how did she get through these horrendous times? How did she just eke out an existence with this fear, with this danger haunting her, with shortages, food, medicine, everything? It was impossible. What would she do to survive? What moral corners would she cut? How far would she go? And the more I thought about this, the more I started to think about, what if she has a child? How far will a woman go to save that child, especially if it's not especially, but it's somehow a helpless infant child, is even more of a problem for this woman on her own, as Charlotte is, because her husband, who's in the French army, dies very early. As I said, there was almost no fighting in France. The army was routed immediately. So the more I thought about that, the more Charlotte began to grow and what she would do and her problems there. You're quite right about the second part. The book takes place in 1944 and 45, and then later in 54 in New York City, in Paris under the occupation, then in the city. And my original thought was that Charlotte would go into fashion or beauty or something like this, because the women I had read about or known as a child, when I was way older, of course, who were European immigrants who came to New York, frequently did go into fashion or beauty or something like that. And Charlotte was having none of it. And that's the most fun, when a character takes off and says, I'm not going to do that. I worked at a bookstore in Paris. And suddenly, when I came to New York, my first job was in publishing, and it all began to come back to me. And some of the people I worked with were inspirations for some of the characters here. They're minor characters, but it's not true. One of the major characters was inspired by a man in publishing I respected greatly. And some of the incidents, again, they're minor, like a mystery coming back from the printer. The entire print run has no last page, so nobody knows who done it. And this was a crisis when I was working there, and Charlotte has this crisis. So that was pure fun, and I didn't have to do any research, because although, of course, by the time I was working in publishing, the industry had changed, human nature doesn't. And so it was just, that was great fun.
So we've already talked a little bit about the specifics in these stories that have to do with the fact that protagonists are women. Obviously, Hannah Weiss is doing nuclear physics alongside male colleagues, and Charlotte Foray is working at a senior level in publishing in a male-dominated atmosphere. I found myself thinking in reading both books that each of them was kind of doing her field backwards and in heels, to quote Ginger Rogers' famous line. Why are these important stories to tell from a feminist standpoint? Maybe, Jan, you want to comment first on that?
Well, for me, there's one obvious reason, which is that the actual inspiration for Hannah, Dr. Lisa Meitner, is not widely known. And I certainly hoped that by writing this book, I would increase interest in her. She was erased by her colleague Otto Hahn, along with the Nobel Prize Committee, because in 1945 they awarded the Nobel Prize for the discovery of nuclear fission to Otto Hahn and his male assistant. And Lisa Meitner was sitting in the audience, and she wrote in her diary, "I'm so disappointed that he didn't even mention my name." And that broke my heart, honestly, because, I mean, Rosalind Franklin was also not recognized. The Nobel Prize Committee has not the best track record in terms of actually recognizing women, and that's many people have written about that, and I hope it will change. But the idea of her sitting in the audience and having to make peace with that, and having to kind of excuse her partner because there were things she had gotten, and he was a friend of hers and supporter of hers when really very few other people were. But then, you know, he kind of went along with this idea that somehow she had nothing to do with the discovery. That was impetus enough to get me to feel like, well, really the record needs to be corrected. I also think it is very, very important for younger women to know that there are women in history, perhaps not in the textbooks, but maybe not in the textbooks because they were erased from history, but they were there and they were doing their work. And to know, I mean, STEM, for instance, you know, is not a field that women traditionally go into or feel they belong in. And here was a woman who was an absolute genius, who had fought every step of the way because she was so gifted, who did make the great discovery of the 20th century. That's important for people to know, whether she was recognized or not. I wanted to make sure that somebody was telling her story. So there's that level of sort of wanting to right wrongs in history. But for me also, there was something very personal, because I did work as a director in Hollywood for a long time. And at a time when it was not even as open as it is now. It was, you know, when I broke into the business as a director, there were probably 5 women, period, directing anything, film, television, anything. So I had a very personal experience of being the only woman in the room and being called sir when I was on the set. You know, I'd say something, they'd say, "Yes, sir," and then they'd go, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry, ma'am." I'd said, "Oh God, I prefer sir to ma'am anytime." But you know, I had really broken a lot of boundaries in terms of my work as a director, and so I absolutely identified with Lisa Meitner. Even though our pursuits were different, I discovered as I was doing research that the pursuit of pure science is very, very similar to the creative pursuit. It is a creative pursuit. And so I really understood, I really understood the character from that point of view. And I'll say one other thing, just because this is slightly off your question, but I think important. Because this is about science and about how science can be either manipulated, or you can actually listen to the scientists and honor them. It is fascinating to me how we are now in a situation that is so parallel to the one at Los Alamos, in the sense that we now have a pandemic that had we actually listened to the scientists from the very beginning, I think we would be in a very different situation than we are. But there were politicians who intervened who decided that their purposes were more important than the actual data. And so the book, in a way, and I don't know that women really have anything to do with it, although I like to think that women have purer motives than men, but that's probably not true. But the fact that listening to science and understanding the morality of it is very important. So that entered into it also. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, well, the politicization of science, you could say that, misogyny or exclusion of women is a kind of politics as well, and obviously politics overlapping with science in a negative way. So, of course, there's quite a lot of politics internal to the publishing house, but also about questions of what should be published and not. In the 1950s segment in Paris Never Leaves You, there's also the quality, I think, that Charlotte is kind of a strong female presence in what otherwise is kind of a boys' club, or at least I have the feeling the 1950s publishing was kind of a boys' club. So, Ellen, do you want to talk a little bit about why her story in the publishing house is particularly important to tell at this time?
It's certainly true that even in the 50s, there were more women in publishing than in science or a lot of other, certainly business. But they were never at the top. And when they were at the top, again, they didn't get credit. It was the same thing. Blanche Knopf, it was the two of them, but it was never known as her house, Blanche and Alfred. But the interesting thing is, in some ways, Charlotte is probably the least feminist of the protagonists that I've written about. After Margaret Sanger and as I said, Eleanor Roosevelt, where do you go for feminism there? But the interesting thing is Charlotte is fighting traditional women's roles. She's protecting her daughter and she's surviving. From a point of view of just writing, which some people are, sometimes readers are interested in hearing this. The most feminist comments, paragraphs from this book are on the cutting room floor. I had to take them out because they just were taking me off on a different tangent. But Charlotte reaches New York and her daughter goes to a private school on the Upper East Side. And Charlotte is an outlier here. She's French. The other mothers don't like her. The other mothers, of course, do not work because they're all moneyed women married to men with plenty of money, and they're mothers, and they feel sorry. They don't like Charlotte for a lot of reasons. She's an outsider. She dresses too well. She dresses too well on half the money. She's French, or a quarter of the money, but they feel sorry for her because she has to go out to work, and there's a lot of pity there. And that I remember from the 50s. That was definitely the attitude. If you had a friend whose parents were divorced and her mother had to go out to work, oh, it was so sad. Everybody pitied her, and it was a terrible thing. And those women, in some ways, had it a lot better, but we won't go into that.
Perhaps that's interesting that you mentioned that about the feminist or less feminist aspects of the book, but of course, feminism, I believe, certainly wants to create more opportunities for women in all sorts of fields and all sorts of areas of expertise, but also just wants to value the experiences in life that women are actually having, which include defending your child and doing what's best for your family and so forth, and validating and honoring those stories as well. So yeah, it works both ways. So Ellen, looking at your research process, the book is very focused, it seems to me, and yet it's got a lot of richness of history. I think of Tolkien talking about you have to have the sense of here's the story, and then there's the gigantic, iceberg of sense of larger reality underwriting it. Can you talk a little bit about how you decided which bits of the history needed to be explained in detail, like how much context we needed about the situation in France during the war, and what could be summarized, and which of those index cards you kind of had to let go of to focus on this specific story?
Yes, I love talking about the research because I do so much of it in the library. there's an image, I've heard other writers use it, that you do the research and then you walk into another room, close the door behind you, and begin the writing. And to some extent, that's true. It's true for me anyway, because you don't want to keep piling on the facts. I learned this when I first started out writing. It's what the syndrome I call it. If I know it, you're going to read it. And it's really you have to be careful not to let that happen. On the other hand, I find that I can never close the door completely, because you read something and you think, well, this is very interesting, but it's not going to apply to the story I'm writing. But it stays with you. And suddenly it comes back and you say, oh my God, that's really important. So then you go back into the reading room and you read and you make your notes and whatnot, and you try to make it all seamless. I did have a wonderful experience in the library with this book. I mean, I always have wonderful experiences in the library, but this was fascinating. And it's the open stacks of the wonderful New York Society Library. I went down to Stack 2, History, to look for another book set about Paris under the occupation. And there was a spine, a title of another book, Spine Facing Out, of course, that caught my eye. I won't say what it was, because for those who haven't read it, I don't want to do any spoilers here. But it was such an unusual title. And at first I thought it was play on words, and then I took it out and I started to read it, and I realized, no, this was fascinating. I ended up sitting down on the floor in the stacks and reading for about 2 hours. By the time I emerged, I had one character had completely transformed. I had a much more complicated moral issue at the heart of this. And I was fascinated to find out that I have many friends who are professional historians. Most of them had never heard of this fact, this chapter of World War II history. And it would have been if I hadn't been wandering through Stack 2, it would have been a lesser book. I'm absolutely convinced. So I thank everybody at the library for this.
Knows. So thinking a little bit about research process, I believe, Jan, this is your first published novel, but obviously you have a distinguished career in screenwriting of topics. So can you talk a little bit about how your research and writing process for screenwriting did or did not prepare you to do the research and writing for Hannah's War? And if you particularly want to talk about the science research, because I think your background is not in physics, and yet the physics is also, well portrayed, at least for this layperson, in the book, about that research.
Well, I actually, I find that the research and the building of story almost go hand in hand for me. It's not as if I do the research and then walk out of the room and never go back. Because of screenwriting, I am used to doing an incredibly detailed outline before I write anything. And sometimes I will write things and still go back to the outline and revise. And then, so it's not a kind of 1-2 process. And what happened to me is that I started really with the one inspiration, which was the story of Lisa Meitner. And as I found historical incidents, I began to feel like, oh my goodness, there's so many parallels here between things that were going on in Germany and things that were going on in America. And I discovered, how much, for example, anti-Semitism there was in America that I had not really known about specifically. And so all of that richness started to build, and I started to add things. I was very careful not to shoehorn things into the outline. I think I was very careful not to say, oh, this is so fascinating, I've got to put it in the book. I would put it in if it actually elaborated on a story that I was already telling. And so there was a certain point in the outline pretty early on where I kind of woke up one day and thought, oh my God, I'm going to have to learn about nuclear physics. And I was shocked and horrified because I went to Brearley, as I mentioned, very good education all around, but physics and math were definitely not my strong suits. I was a theater nerd and an English nerd, and what saved me, I think, was that, first of all, I will say that, you know, one thing that Brearley did was it taught you how to learn. So if there was something that you needed to learn, it gave me the tools to do the research and to start to figure it out. But the other thing, and I think this may also have to do with my background in screenwriting, but also in theater, is really the idea that character does drive story. So the things that I had to know from the point of view of the characters, not from the point of view of somebody writing an exegesis on nuclear physics. And characters, I've noticed, it's the people who want to show off their research that have the characters tell other characters that should know what they're talking about, have them tell everything that they've just done. And, you know, as a writer, as an actor, you realize people don't ever talk that way. You know, I don't ever go, hey, Ellen, you know, I spent this day writing and this is what I was working on and how was your day? Characters talk about the things that they share. And I also had a character in Jack Delaney who knew nothing about nuclear physics. So he could be a stand-in for me and for the reader and ask the really, they're not dumb questions, but the really simple questions, like, what is splitting an atom? How does that actually work? What does that mean? And so he became a vehicle for the questions that I knew I needed to address in order for the reader to understand. But for me, it really was all about sort of knowing the historical ideas and then going on to the level of the characters to see what was needed and what I could pull in and what needed to stay on the cutting room floor.
Yes, one of the things that I like very much about both of the books is the mix of perspectives, sometimes first person, sometimes third person, sometimes it's present tense, sometimes it's past tense. It's all very well used. And also it gives the sense, I think, of the characters being witnesses to one another in what's going on, and also drawing the reader in to be a witness of what's going on. I mention that as context because I would like to bring up the epigraphs. Both of these books have wonderfully evocative epigraphs at the beginning, and I hope that they may evoke something good here. So, thinking of Paris Never Leaves You, there are two little epigraphs. To hate, except in the abstract, is more difficult than it might seem, which is credited to Flora Grew, Diary and Duo, Paris 1940 to 45, which is not a book I'm familiar with, but I assume, Ellen, it came up in your research. And then Hillel the Elder, one of my favorite unrelated historical figures. Do not judge your fellow human being until you have stood in your place. So, Ellen, would you like to talk a little about where in your research and writing process those quotes came to you and how they laid out guiding ideas for the book?
Yes, the second one from Hillel the Elder, do not judge someone until, I say do not judge your fellow woman, not he said man, of course, until you've stood in her shoes. That was really the beginning of the book. I mean, I don't know where I read this the first time, but it was essentially, as I said, what I was thinking about with Charlotte. What would you, I was thinking, and I hope the reader would think, what would I do in her place? But how would I make these decisions? How important, you know, how do I navigate my own feelings about honor and decency and my country and my daughter, my child? How do I save her? So, you know, if she did things, if she made compromises, there is a character in the book, as you know, Siri, who judges her very harshly. And she's the one character who has not lived through any sort of horror, but she feels free. She works with people who have, and she feels free to judge Charlotte's actions. And I think it's just a very important thing to me, not judging people when you have not had their experience. It's too easy to, I think. The second quote, the first quote you read, it's a wonderful duo diary, two teenage sisters, one's 20 and one's 15 about, who kept a diary, a dual diary during the occupation. And I'm pretty sure that's in the library too. And they were wonderful observers. They went on to become writers. And the more I wrote and the more I thought about this, by the time I read this dual diary and her quote, it seemed to me that this had been turning in my mind for a long time, that it's one thing when you read about atrocities to say, oh, those people are despicable. You know, we cannot forgive them anything. And when the person lives next door and you get to know the person, it's a little different. Now, obviously, this is not true if you're in a concentration camp and someone is torturing you, or if the Gestapo is rounding you up, something like that. But when you come to understand somebody's life, and you see the conflict, it's very hard to judge that person. So it's related to the Philadelphia. The other thing about that is, and this is the negative side, perhaps, of that problem. Assume it's after the war, and there's somebody who was a Nazi or who was a collaborator and did terrible things. And you know that person as a neighbor, and then discover that he or she was not such a decent human being. How does this come? You know, is it better to forgive? I don't know. I have no answers. The whole book is about raising these questions, and certainly I don't pretend to answer any of them.
So I see some good chat in the chat. I'm not at this point. So thank you for a question. If anybody else has a question to add in the chat, I'm going to toss in, read you and then add to the chat myself, the epigraph from Hannah's War, which is a quote from Dr. Lisa Meitner. Those blessed with a brilliant mind and a gift for science have a higher duty that comes before discovery, a duty to humanity. Science can be used for good or evil, so it's incumbent upon scientists to ensure that their work makes the world a better place. So Jen, I think you've spoken to some of these questions before, but do you want to talk a little bit about why that epigraph in particular jumped out at you, and that was kind of the central quote to use?
Yes. I actually did not have an epigraph. I turned the manuscript in without one, and I continued to read because at that point I was so enmeshed in all of it that I couldn't turn my brain off. And I found an interesting story. I was asked to write a couple of articles by Little Brown and by my PR person about Lisa Meitner for publicity purposes. And so I was reading those, and I discovered that Lisa Meitner was buried, and she left instructions for what should be on her tombstone. And her beloved nephew, who was there when she actually discovered nuclear fission, because they were snow skiing together, and she stopped and started doing equations in the snow with her ski poles and said, aha, I know what happened. But anyway, she left instructions with him as to what should be on her tombstone. And it is, here lies Lisa Meitner, a scientist and a humanist. And I thought how significant it was that she put humanists in a more important position. I mean, you know, she was an incredible scientist worthy of the Nobel Prize, but for her, being a humanist actually had more weight. And that's when I found that quote. And I called Little Brown and I said, is it too late to add an epigraph to the book, and they said, well, no, but get it in right now. And so I sent that in because it seemed to sum up so beautifully, in the words of the real person, so many of the themes that I was investigating about where your responsibilities are. Many of the same things that Ellen was talking about. Where are your responsibilities to healing the world, to tikkun olam? Does that come before or after your responsibility towards scientific discovery? It just wrapped everything up very beautifully, and I felt it was also a tribute to his work, which I very much wanted to include.
So I noticed a couple of things in the chat that I'd like to highlight. I think this is a comment rather than a question, but it does really add to what's being discussed. I think it demonstrates the enormous capacity for mankind to compartmentalize. One can be an atrocious human being, yet be a good friend and parent. And I think the comment may be about both the, like, what if you find out that your neighbor was a collaborator or a Nazi, or somebody in different parts of their life can express different things for good or bad. At work, they're accomplishing one thing. And anybody want to throw in anything about?
I could say something about that, because I wanted to actually pick up on this and things that Ellen was saying. One of the interesting challenges I felt that I had to meet in the book was really to address that question that I always hear people asking. Well, if things were so bad in Germany, and if people knew, all about these concentration camps, why didn't they leave? Why didn't the Jews just leave? And the thing that was fascinating about Lisa Meitner and the character of Hannah is in fact that she stayed until 1938. So until the annexation of Austria. And she really, left then because it was crystal clear that her life was in danger if she didn't leave. And so I felt that there was an important journey of exploration to talk about what was going on in Germany from the point of view of somebody who wants to stay. Because I think that was probably most people's situation. I mean, first of all, she was doing the work she loved. She was doing work that she couldn't do anywhere else. I mean, she was constantly worried if she left, where would she find another place to do this work? In the book, she's also fallen in love. So there's also the sense of the beauty of her life there, despite everything that's going on. And also, I thought, and it means more and more now because of things that are going on in our country, the Nuremberg laws, which I even quote many of them in the book, they were designed so carefully to chip away in the tiniest, subtlest ways at rights. So, it's almost ludicrous. Like, you can go to buy bread on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from certain places. And then later, you can buy bread on Monday and Friday from those places. Or you can buy bread Monday and Friday from 10 to 1. It was like these things just sort of, you adapt, people adapt. And 4 years ago or 3 years ago, I remember everybody being absolutely horrified by the rounding up of people at the border and putting them in cages. And people saying that this is this is immoral, this is impossible, this can't happen here, right? And everybody was up in arms about it. And then there was another outrage that was even bigger or even more ludicrous. And so we adapted. Mm-hmm. Now we're talking about it again because we've been discovering that they've been giving some of these women hysterectomies. But nobody was talking about all of that a year ago or 2 years ago. So it's just it's sort of an investigation of how we adapt to circumstances, and we try to continue to live our lives, our very small lives, given what's important to us. And it's not the same thing as looking with hindsight and saying, but if everybody knew that they were taking Jews off the camps, why didn't people rise up in protest? Why didn't Jews leave? And I think that has become a much more important issue right now than I knew it would be when I was writing the book.
Yeah, and that's that compartmentalization. Yes, please.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to jump in what John said about incremental. That was really important, that the Nazis put down these laws, passed these laws little by little. 1 week that you couldn't go to a park, 1 week you couldn't go to a movie, that sort of thing. But there's something more there. I mean, in Eastern Europe, they couldn't leave. In Germany, there's a line, and I'm using it in the book I'm working on now. The Jewish love affair with Germany in the early years of the Third Reich was one of the great unrequited love affairs of history. A lot of German Jews, and this was true in France and Netherlands too, and this for Germany, of course, Anne Frank's father, they considered themselves Germans first and Jews second. And they thought that these laws applied to Eastern European Jews, not to them. They were Germans. And by the time they realized it applied to them, because Hitler did not care whether you were an observant Jew, you were a half Jew, you were a quarter Jew, if you had Jewish blood, that was it. And by the time they learned, it was too late to leave. And that's the other thing, that, people who got their children out on a kinder transport, we look back and we say, what a smart thing to do. No, you have a 5-year-old, you're going to send that child off alone? I mean, these decisions, they must have been heart-wrenching. I'm sorry, I just had to jump in there because it's really one of the issues of that era. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it seems to me that both the quality of compartmentalization and the quality of adaptability might in fact speak to the final question that I have here. So I think we'll close with some comments related to this. We pointed out earlier that both of your short readings and both books in fact open with fairly shocking scenes. I mean, particularly the question highlights why, Ellen, you chose to read a scene from Very Early in Paris Never Leaves You, where a woman is being stripped and humiliated because she was a collaborator. Like, why the extreme, shocking scenes at the outset?
I guess it is extreme. It's not extreme. I guess it's shocking. But this is what they did. And somebody in an interview recently asked me, why did Charlotte feel so guilty? She didn't do anything so terrible. And some people think she did something terrible, some people think she didn't. But the point is, the rage after the war against people who had collaborated was too vicious. And as I said in the beginning, it was directed especially against women. And I think without this, you wouldn't understand. Without that prologue, you would not understand Charlotte's fear and guilt throughout the rest of the book. So that's why I know it's a little rough. It's necessary.
So I think it absolutely makes sense in the context. And of course, I could say the same about the opening of Hannah's War. I mean, you have to see how big the issue is.
I will also just admit that that's part of the director-screenwriter in me. I always have that knowledge that, boy, by page 10 in your screenplay or 10 minutes into the movie, everyone has to be grabbed by the throat or else they'll walk away and leave, which usually people don't, but they do give up on a movie pretty quickly. And so I had many, many, many beginning scenes in mind. And I actually wrote a number of them and didn't use them. But it did seem to me as if that particular moment really is the moment that everything sort of builds to. And then after she ends up in Fort Leavenworth, there's a process of things that unfolds to reveal the actual truth behind the things that she's been saying. And you don't know if she's been lying or telling the truth up till then, but you do find out at the end. And I think it's a surprise. I think it's a surprise. Most people think they don't expect it, so that's good. But it felt like such a great turning point in the book that I thought it would be a wonderful place to start and then pick up again from. And of course, it's also a dramatic, a very arresting scene, which Ellen is too. And that's usually a good way to start a book, I think.
Absolutely. Yes, the stakes are high, and right off the bat, we find out that the stakes are high. So I think we'll wrap up there. I do want to commend to the audience. Please do read both these books. I'm going to put the link for our bookstore in the chat one more time. We have both books to order from our indie friend, the Corner Bookstore, who joined us for tonight's event. Ellen Feldman's Paris Never Leaves You, Jan Eliasberg's Hannah's War. They're both great, focused stories drawn from this huge and vastly important historical context, and they're both really enjoyable to read. So it's been such a pleasure being with you. Thank you so much, Jan. Thank you so much, Ellen. It's been wonderful. And
it's the next best thing to being in the library. Thank you.